Culturally and geographically, Canada can be most loosely divided into three enormous regions. British Columbia and the prairie provinces of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba comprise Western Canada, the youngest member of this trio, home to the coastal rainforest, the spectacular Rocky Mountains, the northernmost tip of North America's Great Plains, and a huge swath of boreal forest. To the north are the Yukon, Northwest, and Nunavut territories, collectively known as Northern Canada, which boast the storied Klondike goldfields, the enormous Great Bear and Great Slave Lakes, endless tracts of tundra, and the islands of the Arctic archipelago. The third and oldest of Canada's mega-regions, Eastern Canada, consists of Ontario, Canada's most populous province, the land of the Great Lakes, the Canadian Shield, and a string of metropolises known as the Golden Horseshoe. Quebec, the ancient birthplace of French Canada, which contains the historic Laurentian Valley, the eastern end of the Canadian Shield, and the gateways to the two great waterways of early Canadian history, the rugged island of Newfoundland and the adjoining Labrador region, whose rocky shores were the first to be visited by European mariners, and the enchanting maritime provinces of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island, which border the Atlantic Ocean. In this compilation, we will revisit classic monster stories endemic to Eastern Canada. In previous pieces, we have explored Little People legends of Newfoundland and Ontario, vampire tales from the Madawaska Highlands, sea monster stories from Prince Edward Island, hellhound tales from the Maritimes, and Thunderbird myths from the Canadian Shield. In this piece, we will return to one of Canada's oldest monster stories, referencing the Viking sagas, sightings of mysterious felines from New Brunswick and Ontario, sea serpent stories from the St. Lawrence River, an eerie Thunderbird tale from Georgian Bay, and Iroquoian Little People legends from southern Ontario. Enjoy. Towering over Old Quebec City, the historic birthplace of French Canada, is the Chateau Frontenac, a magnificent hotel built by the Canadian Pacific Railway in 1893 in the style of the 17th century chateaux of France's Loire Valley. This Canadian icon stands on the grave of the Chateau Saint-Louis, a historic castle constructed in 1694 on the orders of Louis de Boued, Comte de Frontenac, Quebec's fiery, battle-scarred Governor-General, for whom the present hotel was named. All throughout the establishment, visitors can find memorials to the hotel's implacable namesake in the form of Frontenac's coat of arms, a family crest dominated by an unusual heraldic beast. These armorial bearings feature an azure shield emblazoned with 3 gold talons, surmounted by a crown and flanked by a pair of griffins, the latter being legendary monsters with the upper bodies of eagles and the lower bodies of lions. The raptor feet are supposed to be griffin claws. In 17th century New France, the image of the griffin was so strongly associated with Frontenac that the Count's most trusted agent, explorer René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de la Salle, gave its name to the second real sailing ship to ply the waters of the Great Lakes, and had a wooden rendering of its fearsome image mounted as its figurehead. The adventurer was often heard to declare that he would make the griffin fly above the crows, or help his benefactor triumph over the black-robed Jesuit missionaries of New France, for whom the Governor-General vied for power. The griffin is a monster of the Old World, the subject of an ancient legend born of classical Mediterranean in the Middle East. Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder, in Book 7 of his 1st century encyclopedia, Naturalis Historia, described it as a kind of beast with wings that digs gold out of mines, which, according to ancient Greek historians Herodotus and Aristeas, waged perpetual war with a race of one-eyed men from northern Scythia on the steppes of Eastern Europe. In Book 10 of that same magnum opus, the Roman naturalist described the creature as having ears and a terrible hooked beak, and designated Ethiopia its country of origin. Tradition had it that the griffin was the mortal enemy of horses, and many artistic interpretations of the monster depict it battling with its equine nemesis. The legend of the griffin survived in Europe in the Middle Ages, the conception of its subject crystallizing in the form of an eagle-lion hybrid, which distinguished it from other bestial raptors, like the Anatolian chimera, the winged serpentine goat lion of Greek mythology, or the cockatrice, the rooster-headed dragon of English myth. It took on a noble aspect in the Christian mind, bearing characteristics of both the regal lion, king of the beasts, and the majestic eagle, monarch of the skies, and subsequently developed an association with Christ and the Catholic Church. it found its way into the ornamentation of churches and cathedrals throughout Christendom, and onto the coats of arms of European states, towns, and noble houses. Despite its Old World origins, the legend of the Griffin has a stunning yet little-known parallel in the indigenous folklore of the Laurentian Northwoods. Long before the Comte de Frontenac had his coat of arms emblazoned on the walls of the Chateau Saint-Louis, before La Salle's Le Griffon made its maiden voyage across Lakes Erie, Huron, and Michigan, the Iroquois of upstate New York told stories about a flying predatory mammal which serves as a dark North American counterpart to the eagle-headed lion of Eurasian lore. In their 1908 book, Myths and Legends of the New York State Iroquois, American historians Harriet Maxwell Converse and Arthur Caswell Parker included an old Seneca Iroquois legend about an ominous blue or sky-colored chimera called a Deoniot, or Gashodito, a sort of aerial grim reaper who haunts the tall treetops in the high mountain crests. With the face of a wolf, the wings of a vulture, the body of a panther, and claws like a hawk, the historians wrote, the Deoniot wanders in the pathway of spirits and is one of the emissaries death sends to the earth to gather souls. The sick fear him, the dying hear him clawing at the door, where he whines like a cat if the spirit is departing, or barks like a wolf if it is not ready to travel. The historians went on to describe the creature's panther-like tail, which it lashed as it flew, trailing fire in its wake. His death cry may be mistaken for the mewing of the house cat, they continued, or the bark of a dog at the door, for only the dying can distinguish between the voices. Therefore, Deoniot has the dread of each lodge, where he may at any time enter when death sends him to gather souls. To hear the voice of Deoniot is an evil omen, and some dire calamity will follow those who have listened to it. If Deoniot appears to a person who is not ill, his death will soon follow. While Deoniot is possessed of the ferocity of the wolf, the stealthiness of the panther, the rapaciousness of the vulture, and the claw weapons of the hawk, all these are necessary in his task of gathering evil spirits for death. This obscure Iroquois tradition could be dismissed as the product of native fancy, were it not for an astonishing article avowedly published in some issue of the New York Press, which this author could not locate, and republished in the October 10, 1892 issue of Savannah, Georgia's Morning News. This remarkable story, brought to my attention by my friend and fellow researcher Kevin Gould, is set in the Quebec forest near the village of Saint-Émilie-de-l'Énergie, which lies 33 kilometers northwest of the city of Joliet, which in turn lies on the L'Assomption River, about 36 kilometers northwest of Montreal. Nearly as obscure as the old Seneca legend it evokes, this forgotten event hints at the disturbing possibility that the tale of the Deoniot might be composed of more fact than fable. Montreal, September 27, 1892, the article began. A most extraordinary story comes from Joliet today, which, if true, leaves forever buried in the shadowy shade of oblivion the most fantastic sea serpent that ever plowed the briny. It is an account of the killing, at the little village of Saint-Émilie-de-l'Énergie, of a monster half bird, half beast, whose classification will puzzle the most deeply learned naturalist. While I have not seen the monster in question, the Inquirer correspondent has the story from the mouth of Medard Lassalle, a worthy and reputable farmer of Saint-Émilie-de-l'Énergie, whose son Joseph Lassalle captured and killed it, and also from 3 well-known residents of Joliet, where the monster is now being prepared for exhibition to the scientists of McGill University of Montreal. The story of the capture of the bird beast and its description are as follows. For 2 weeks past, the farmers of Saint-Émilie-de-l'Énergie and neighboring villages have suffered from the depredations of some beast of prey who nightly visited their sheepfolds and carried off some of the finest lambs. It was generally supposed that a bear was in the neighborhood, and the farmers have been on the alert for the capture of his bearship. On Wednesday of last week, Joseph Lassalle, a big young fellow of 25 years, went in search of the supposed bear, armed with a double-barreled rifle. Some 5 miles back in the woods from the village named, he was startled by hearing a loud croaking cry, and looking upward, he saw, circling high above in the air, an immense creature that he at first took to be a monster eagle. The bird, or whatever it was rapidly descending, and Lassalle, who was a crack marksman, took careful aim and fired. The monster was struck and badly wounded by the heavy rifle bullet, and screaming with pain and rage, it came tumbling to the earth. As it landed, he gave it the other barrel of the rifle, and still thinking it was an eagle, rushed on it with his clubbed gun. A terrible battle ensued, lasting for several moments. Then the victory was with the man, and the monster lay dead at his feet. He now had time for a closer inspection of his game, but the thing presented such an awful and unnatural appearance that he was terror-stricken and ran back to the village for help. He was accompanied back by his father and 4 other young farmers. The monster was then carefully examined by the farmers, who described it as follows. It had 2 great wings, measuring 15 feet from tip to tip. The head, which was 15 inches in circumference, resembles that of a large monkey. The body was 5 feet long, and while the back part was covered with big black feathers, the under part was covered with fur or coarse hair. The feet or claws resembled the legs of a wolf, and under the tail feathers was a long appendage with a tuft at the end that looked like the tail of a calf. Lying with wings extended on the ground, the monster looked as big as a horse, and when weighed was found to turn the scale at 300 pounds. A team had to be sent to bring it back to the village. Then it was seen by Alderet Charlon, a councillor of the town of Joliet, who was going through the country purchasing produce. He bought the monster, probably for exhibition purposes, from the Lassalles, and Friday evening last, it was brought by train to his place of business in Joliet, where it is now in process of preparation to prevent decay, after which it will be shipped to this city for scientific examination. Those who claim to have seen the monster say it is the most extraordinary sight they ever witnessed, and it is hardly possible that all the respectable men who tell the story about it can be lying. And if not, what can the monster be that at the present is causing such a sensation in the Joliet district of the province? This Quebecois chimera, in physical appearance at least, bears eerie resemblance to the flying portent of Iroquois legend. Its monkey-like head would not be dissimilar to the Doniot's wolf head, or the primate referenced a baboon. Its large black wings sharply evoke the vulture wings of the Seneca monster, in all but scale. Its lupine legs and furry coat are comparable to the panther-like body of the Iroquois omen, discounting the latter's hawk-like talons. And its bovine tail is consistent with the panther-like appendage of the Haudenosaunee Angel of Death. Barring the possibility that the story is a fabrication, the tale from Sainte-Amélie de l'Énergie gives weight to the notion that there might be more to the legend of the Doniot than Longhouse myth. Perhaps the heraldic beast of the Chateau Frontenac is not the only griffin to haunt Quebec. In 1587, at the height of the Age of Discovery, 43-year-old Italian cartographer Urbano Monte completed his magnum opus, a detailed map of the known world. On what would appear to be Baffin Island, Canada's largest island, located at the eastern end of the Arctic archipelago, the cartographer included an Italian caption which reads, "Here are pygmies, less than 1 arm's length tall. They live from childhood on a single leg, and they hop on it like ostriches." Like his contemporaries, French cartographer Pierre de Sellier, who described a race of Arctic American pygmies in his 1550 map of the world, and French geographer Gerardus Mercator, who would include a similar caption on his 1595 map of the North Pole, Monty appears to have drawn this startling information from the saga of Eric the Red, a 13th century Icelandic chronicle of the Norse Vikings' 11th century discovery of North America. In conjunction with its slightly older counterpart, the Greenlander saga, this manuscript describes Norse discoveries of 3 regions west of Greenland. The northernmost of these was Helluland, a barren domain of Arctic foxes and flat stones, which some believe to be the eastern shores of Baffin Island. Below Helluland, Viking mariners discovered Markland, a region carpeted with dense evergreen forests filled with wild animals, popularly believed to be northern Labrador. South of Markland, Norse explorers came upon a land abundant with lush meadows and wild grapes, which they called Vinland. Vinland's location is a subject of fierce debate amongst historians. Many propose it is the island of Newfoundland, on the northern tip of which, near the town of Lonsa Meadows, Norwegian trapper Helge Ingstad discovered the remains of a Viking colony in 1960. Others, observing that wild grapes do not grow north of New Brunswick, maintain that Vinland must be located further south. In the saga of Eric the Red, A party of Viking explorers abandoned their temporary settlement at Vinland after surviving a skirmish with the Skrawling Jarl, the country's diminutive fur-clad natives. They sailed their longships northwest along North America's Atlantic coast before proceeding up an east-flowing river. One morning, while camped on the river's northern shore, the Vikings were attacked by a one-footer, a mythical one-legged dwarf which hopped from place to place. Sometimes referred to as monopods and sciapods, these characters feature in the writings of the ancient Greeks and Romans. Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder described these creatures in Book 7 of his 1st century encyclopedia, Naturalis Historia. He avowedly drew his information from the tome Indica, an exposition on the Indian subcontinent written in the 5th century BC by Greek historian Ctesias, who served as court physician to Persian Emperor Artaxerxes II. He speaks also of another race of men, Pliny wrote of his Hellenic source, who are known as monocoli, who have only one leg, but are able to leap with surprising agility. These same people are also called sciapode, because they are in the habit of lying on their backs during the time of the extreme heat and protect themselves from the sun by the shade of their feet. These agile one-footed monsters were said to abide in India, and their appearance in the saga of Eric the Red might be reflective of a mistaken belief held by the Vikings that Helluland, Markland, and Vinland constituted the eastern shores of the Orient. The one-footer hopped up to the Vikings and shot their leader in the lower abdomen with an arrow. The Norseman drew out the projectile and joked that Vinland must be bountiful indeed, as he had grown such a belly that winter that the arrow had failed to harm him. The one-footer then hopped away to the north, quickly outdistancing the Vikings who pursued him. The Norsemen briefly ventured north into what they assumed must be the land of the one-footers. Not particularly desirous of another encounter with the little arrow-wielding monsters, however, the explorers soon decided to return to their ship. More than 5 centuries after the events described in the Icelandic sagas, Breton explorer Jacques Cartier made his second voyage to Canada on behalf of King Francis I of France. Guided by 2 Iroquois princes, whom they had taken aboard on the Gaspé Peninsula during their first transatlantic voyage the previous year, Cartier and his crew explored the St. Lawrence River, traveling as far as the Iroquois village of Hochelaga, near present-day Montreal, Quebec. The explorers spent a miserable, sickly winter in the village of Stadacona, located near the site of present-day Quebec City. There, their Iroquois host, Chief Donnacona, regaled them with fabulous stories about an inland kingdom filled with gold and rubies, and peopled with pale-skinned men in woolen clothes, which could be reached by the Saguenay River. He told us furthermore, Cartier wrote in the relation of his second voyage, that he had been to another country whose inhabitants have only one leg. If we assume that this country lies in the general direction of the mysterious kingdom of Saguenay, then the one-legged men described by Donnacona appear to dwell in the same general region as the hopping monsters referenced in the Icelandic sagas, namely the eastern Canadian shield of present-day Quebec and Labrador. Traditional Ojibwe lore has it that the vast depths of Lake Superior are haunted by a colossal underwater lynx, a powerful elemental spirit known as Mishapishu, which held sway over the wind and waves. Natives sometimes made sacrifices to this demi-deity, throwing a live dog into the water as an offering, before setting out in their birch bark canoes into the perilous freshwater sea they called Kichigami. Mishapishu is perhaps the most famous inmate of the menagerie of legendary cats that prowl the landscape of native Canadian tradition, the legend of which this author hopes to explore more thoroughly in the future. In this piece, we will explore other, more obscure folkloric felines endemic to the Great White North. From a titanic predator said to haunt the subarctic forests, to a mysterious black panther spotted in the eastern provinces. Enjoy. Filed away in the scattered archives of the Society for the Investigation of the Unexplained, the papers of the late Ivan T. Sanderson, styled the godfather of cryptozoology, is a letter written to Sanderson on July 12, 1971, by a man whose signature this author was unable to decipher. The man claimed that, in the fall of the previous year, while visiting the historic town of Moosonee, Ontario, on the Moose River Delta near the southern tip of James Bay, he met an old Indian named Gugo Naninesh, who claimed to have come from the Nahanni area. This region, the valley of the South Nahanni River, is a sprawling vale in the Mackenzie Mountains, which runs along the border of Canada's Northwest and Yukon territories. Since the early 1900s, this remote subarctic hideaway, popularly known as the Headless Valley, has earned itself a reputation as a place where prospectors die mysterious deaths, where a wealth of gold ore lies hidden in the rocks, and where monsters from a forgotten age defy extinction. The native astounded the letter writer by enumerating some of the gigantic predators that roamed the wilderness of his homeland, describing an enormous, long-nosed creature, eerily reminiscent of the woolly mammoth, and detailing the appearance of a monstrous dog, of which all other animals lived in fear. Its habits are disgusting, if it exists, the letter writer wrote of the colossal canine. Part carrion eater, it can take a bear apart, but prefers to live on injured or young animals. Its delight is to snatch the young from the mother, whilst she is in the process of giving birth. Also said to attack man on sight. Almost invincible, he has but one enemy. Now hang on to your hat. That enemy is a lion. I thought he meant puma, which I wouldn't have believed anyway, but no, he meant a lion. The lion itself is a giant, at least as big as a bloody dog, and apparently afraid of nothing. Very hairy, with a large woolly mane extending nearly all over its body. The lion kills everything when in the mood, including the bears, moose, and what would appear to be mammoths. In addition to evoking the famous Smilodon or saber-toothed tiger, this enormous Nahanni lion elicits images of the North American cave lion, an extinct subspecies of lion believed to have roamed the western end of the continent from Canada to Mexico, before dying out in the last ice age. This fearsome feline is believed to have been 125% the size of the modern African lion, making it one of the largest cats to ever exist. It must be mentioned that the North American cave lion is believed to have lacked the shaggy mane that fringes the heads and necks of male African lions. This attribute, however, is not necessarily inconsistent with the creature described by Google, as the letter writer called his informant, whose large woolly mane covered its entire body. Another lion-like animal said to prowl the Canadian wilderness is a creature dubbed the maned American lion, which cryptozoologist George M. Aberhart included in Volume 1 of the 2013 edition of his Fortean classic, Mysterious Creatures, A Guide to Cryptozoology. Aberhart described the creature as resembling a male African lion in appearance, with a shaggy coat of brown or tawny fur, a thick mane around the neck, a muscular frame with a length of 5 to 8 feet, and a shoulder height of 3 feet. While most sightings of this mystery feline took place across the United States, there are at least 3 set in Canada, namely 2 in the maritime province of New Brunswick, and 1 in northern Ontario. Aberhart avowedly drew his information on these Canadian sightings from cryptozoologist Lauren Coleman's 2007 book, Mysterious America. Coleman, in turn, derived his information from the fieldwork of the late Bruce Stanley Wright, a forest biologist who served as lieutenant commander in a Royal Canadian Navy combat diving unit during World War II. The first documented Canadian sighting of the maned American lion took place on March 1, 1941, on a forestry road in western New Brunswick. While hauling a log down this remote byway, a man driving a team of horses came upon what he described as a large cat-like animal sitting in the middle of the road. The teamster characterized the animal's color as a mixture of yellow-gray and reddish, with hair so long in the collar area that it made the feline's neck appear thicker than its head. The big cat responded to the panicked whinnies of the horses by coolly rising and padding off into the woods. The next Canadian sighting of a maned American lion took place in a Canadian Shield far to the northwest, in the town of Kapuskasing, Ontario, located on the remote Ontario Highway 11, roughly halfway between Lake Superior and James Bay. In June 1960, local farmer Leopold Dallaire reported seeing what he described as an African lion on his property. The creature had light tan fur with a mane around its head and neck, and a bushy tuft of fur ornamented the tip of its 4-foot tail. It stood at least 3 feet tall and had a length of about 5 feet from its nose to the base of its tail. In response to the sensational report, an Ontario wildlife officer named Ori Lewis is said to have made the derisive remark, "Mr. Dallaire has been watching too much TV." 4 years after Dallaire's sighting, the maned American lion surfaced once again in the wilderness of western New Brunswick, this time in the wooded hills south of the St. John River, roughly 40 kilometers southwest of the provincial capital of Fredericton. While traipsing along Magundy Stream with a pair of bird hunters, hunting guide M. MacDonald of the southwesterly village of McAdam spotted what he described as a large dark brown cat with a long tail, which he claimed looked exactly like an African lion. What is the mysterious maned feline that stalks through the forests of eastern Canada? In his book, George Aberhart put forth 3 theories as to its identity, proposing that it might be an African lion escaped from a zoo or circus, a misidentified domestic dog, the Chow Chow, Brittany Spaniel, and Newfoundland being suspected candidates, or a relict North American cave lion. Despite his contribution to the legend of the maned American lion, zoologist Bruce Stanley Wright, from whose fieldwork the above reports derive, is perhaps best known as an early champion of the notion that a breeding population of eastern cougars, a subspecies of mountain lion, popularly believed to have been extirpated in eastern Canada by the mid-20th century, survives in Canada's maritime provinces and the states of northern New England. Wright outlined his controversial theory in his seminal 1959 book, The Ghost of North America, The Story of the Eastern Panther, and his 1972 book, The Eastern Panther, A Question of Survival, sparking a debate that endures to this day. Scattered among the eyewitness accounts that Wright documented in his books are 20 sightings of black panthers in the province of New Brunswick, described as long-tailed, cougar-like animals with black pigmentation. To the layman with a passing familiarity with wildcats, the term Black Panther might evoke images of the character Bagheera from Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Book, the mascot of the African-American Communist Organization active in the 1960s and 70s, or the bestial namesake of Marvel Comics' most famous African superhero. These creatures are melanistic leopards and jaguars, ordinary wildcats from the jungles of Africa, Asia, and South America, which owe their dark pigmentation to a relatively rare genetic mutation. Interestingly, although a mere couple of black bobcats have been snared in New Brunswick, and the first black lynx was caught on camera in Whitehorse, Yukon in the summer of 2022, melanism has never been observed in cougar populations, begetting the eerie notion that the black panthers spotted in eastern Canada might be members of a species altogether unknown to science. The earliest Black Panther sighting, which Wright documented in his 1972 book, is both the most dramatic and the most unusual. On the evening of November 22, 1951, while returning home from work, a lumberjack named Herman Bellier was attacked by what appeared to be a rabid black panther near the village of Cambridge Narrows, near the southern end of New Brunswick. "I was returning home about 6 p.m., the woodcutter said. I came to a pole fence, and before crossing it I hit it with my axe. Within seconds, I heard 5 loud yells off in the woods. I walked about 100 yards further, when I heard 4 or 5 more yells. I looked back and saw it coming, leaping. I ran a short way when it overtook me, so I had to stop and face it. When I stopped, it stopped, and stood up on its rear legs, with mouth open and sizzling, and with front paws waving, it charged. I swung the axe at it, but it jumped back, and I missed, so I ran for it and whooped. It leapt off in the woods, and I ran for the house, but didn't run very far before I saw it coming again, and had to stop and swing the axe at it. It jumped up to one side, so I ran for it, and it ran off into the woods again. It repeated the same thing over and over 5 or 6 times, until I came to a field where I could see the lights of the houses, and then it leapt off and never came back. When asked what the creature looked like, the woodsman replied, the animal was black or dark gray. Its tail was at least 2.5 feet long, and it was at least 6 feet long. The most significant flurry of New Brunswick Black Panther sightings took place in the woods surrounding CFB Gagetown, a large Canadian Forces base constructed in the mid-1950s in southwestern New Brunswick, just southeast of the provincial capital of Fredericton. In September 1955, Camp Commandant Lieutenant Colonel Waugh was walking his dog Pal, a robust Chesapeake Bay retriever, along a dirt road at the base of Blue Mountain, beyond the far southeastern end of the base, when he saw a large black feline watching his canine companion at the edge of the trees. It was a cat, he said, larger than Pal, black in color, and with a long cat-like tail. My first thought was to get a hold of the dog, as if it tackled him, he would have no chance. However, as soon as it saw me, it ran up the very steep slope at an amazing speed. 8 months later, 2 soldiers returning to the base at night caught two large reflective green eyes in the glare of their vehicle's headlights. The eyes proved to belong to what one of the soldiers described as a cat slightly larger than the colonel's dog, and black in color. It had a long tail that swished from side to side as we passed. Following a succession of more prosaic cougar sightings, along with reports of a mountain lion described as shaggy and roughed up, which descriptions Wright interpreted as indications of mange, more Black Panther sightings were made near the base and in a cemetery outside Fredericton in the summer of 1962. The most noteworthy sighting was made by Corporal Blair Hare of the Royal Canadian Dragoons, who observed a pair of jet black panthers with his binoculars near the site of Lieutenant Colonel Waugh's 1955 sighting. Similar reports of black panthers were made throughout the province. Back in July 1948, two veterinary professionals, Drs. D.B. Butterwick and Dr. J.M. Barrett, drove past what they identified as a very dark brown panther, with a body as long as a full-grown bear, on the Rishobucto Road east of Fredericton. On September 17, 1951, a logger came upon what he first took to be a young black bear, standing in the pouring rain, on a back road near the city of Bathurst, New Brunswick, on the southern shores of Nipisiguit Bay. As the creature fled into the woods, the logger caught a glimpse of its long tail, which disqualified it from the ursine family. In March 1958, a man named J.D. MacDonald, while driving alone on a gravel road outside the settlement of Chamcook, New Brunswick, just west of Passamaquoddy Bay, spotted a large cat with a long tail, standing in the ditch. The animal was quite definitely black, MacDonald said, and my first thought was that it was a panther. It may have been 3 feet long, not counting the tail. Several black panther sightings were made in the province in the summer and autumn of 1959. The best documented of these took place on the night of October 21st on a lonely country road in western New Brunswick. While driving, an anonymous witness watched a small dark panther slink across the road in front of him. It was black as a bear, he said, the picture of ease and grace, and about 40 pounds in weight. A year later, on October 29, 1960, a similar creature was spotted by two men driving on a wooded road in the same area. The witnesses described the cat, which they saw walking slowly across the road, as having a length of 3 feet, an 18-inch long tail, and a coat of either black or very dark brown complexion. In July 1961, 3 boys biking to school on the outskirts of Fredericton spotted a large black cat the size of a German shepherd lying in the ditch. Wildlife officers who later responded to the report found the track of a large cat at the place where the animal had been seen. About a year later, another black specimen was allegedly seen on the outskirts of the Devon district at the northeastern end of the city. Black panthers were spotted in New Brunswick on 3 separate occasions in 1967. On August 16th of that year, tractor operator Victor Collette spotted a long-tailed, 4-foot-long jet-black wildcat crossing Hanwell Road near Fredericton while heading to work at 7:50 a.m. It glittered in the sun, he remarked, and its hide would make a beautiful pelt. 2 nights later, a man encamped nearby spotted a large black animal in his yard, with a length of 5 feet and a height of 1.5 feet, which he drove off by rattling his stove lids. 2 months later, a hunter spotted a similar animal in the woods about 10 miles away, as did a pair of observers on the outskirts of Fredericton on August 12, 1970. Wright addressed these mysterious black cougars in an analysis at the end of his book. After disproving some of his early hypotheses that these sightings might be misidentifications of regular colored mountain lions, rendered dark by the position of the sun or wet fur, he wrote, "I now believe there are a few black specimens of the panther in eastern North America. There is one long-shot explanation, to which I give little credence, that the black individuals are escapees. We now know that lions can survive Canadian winters with a minimum of shelter. Why not leopards, who live farther north in the Old World? Perhaps black leopards escaped, or were turned loose in this area, but none have been reported to the authorities. The extreme northeastern section of the panther population has been isolated for more than 100 years, and it is in this section where melanism is most frequently reported. If it had developed in this region as the records indicate, it is an extreme variation that has occurred in an isolated peripheral population." New Brunswick is not the only Canadian province in which black panthers have been spotted. In a 2011 article for the scientific journal Canadian Field Naturalist, in which he made the compelling argument that the wilderness of Ontario supports a population of cougars, wildlife biologist Rick Rosette claimed to have unearthed 52 credible black panther sightings in Canada's Heartland province, but omitted them from his study, as there are no records of a black phase of cougar occurring in North America. In my opinion, he wrote of the subjects of these sightings, they were in all likelihood escaped exotic animals, most likely melanistic leopards or melanistic jaguars, or another species such as a fisher or a small American black bear. I could not find any records or published literature documenting the capture, killing, or photographing of black cougars in North America. Embedded within the article is a trail cam snapshot of a large black wildcat. In what Texan folklorist Michael Mays aptly described as an amazingly nonchalant manner, Rosette identified the animal as a photograph of a melanistic jaguar, taken by a trail camera near Guelph, Ontario in April 2010. Although Rosette neglected to elaborate on any of the black cougar reports he came across, cryptozoologist Michael Newton included an Ontario sighting in an article for the winter 2007-08 issue of the magazine Mysteries. On July 12, 2007, while driving on Trunk Road on the Champlain Trail near Bonfield, Ontario, not far from Lake Nusbonsing, a man named John Wilson spotted something unusual. "I saw this rabbit running straight for my truck, like something was chasing it," he said. "All of a sudden, this black thing came out of the bush. At first, I thought it was just a dog, but when it turned sideways, I saw its long, curvy tail. As soon as it saw me, it headed right back into the bush." According to Newton, local legend has it that the Black Panthers of Ontario are descendants of exotic cats once kept by a farmer from the southwesterly municipality of Powassan. Although the government forced the farmer to destroy his menagerie as part of an effort to curb a tuberculosis outbreak, rumor had it that 4 black kittens survived the purge and fled into the Ontario wilderness, where they proliferated. Cryptozoologist Craig Woolheater, who also documented Wilson's sighting on his website cryptomundo.com, included the testimony of another Bonfield resident named Marlene Tilson, who owned property on Trunk Road. "A few weeks ago," Tilson said, "my husband went out in the back field to feed the horses, and he said he saw something big in black. At first he thought it was a bear, but it had a long tail and was about the size of our Labrador Retriever. You can hear it at night. It has a loud, high pitch, like a screeching sound." Although less common than their New Brunswick and Ontario counterparts, black panther sightings have been reported in other provinces in the eastern half of the country. In his 1972 book, Wright included the report of a 7-foot-long black panther spotted on 4 occasions in Nova Scotia's Quebec Hills at the northern end of the province, namely in June 1951, September and December 1952, and February 1953. In the spring 2009 issue of the magazine Mysteries, the editor alluded to a case in which multiple witnesses saw a large black cat prowling near the remote town of Springdale, near the northern end of Newfoundland in November 2008. And in an article published in the fall 2007 issue of Mysteries, journalist Amy Wolvett described her own sighting of a similar creature on April 9, 2007, which she made while driving her car toward the Sable River at the southern end of Nova Scotia. Upon reporting her sighting to the Provincial Department of Natural Resources, she was told that, despite hundreds of similar reports that they receive every year, the government refuses to acknowledge the existence of such creatures in the province. Another unusual Canadian feline was alluded to by reporter Jim Bronskill in a 1998 article for the Ottawa Citizen. The sliver cat, Bronskill wrote, prowls central Canadian forests, wading in trees to impale humans passing below with its long spiked tail. Bronskill almost certainly obtained this bit of folklore from writer W. Hayden Blackman's 1998 book, The Field Guide to North American Monsters, which includes a section on a creature of American logging lore, a massive wildcat with a spiked tail, said to haunt the forests of the Great Lakes region and central Canada. One of the most repugnant monsters discovered by lumberjacks, Bronskill wrote, is the devious and brutal sliver cat, a devoted man-eater. The beast is somewhat similar to a mountain lion or puma, with a powerful body about 5 feet in length, retractable claws, and razor-sharp senses, including highly developed night vision. The beast, which lives only in the branches of tall trees, can reach up to 300 pounds and be recognized by its low, ominous calls. Blackman went on to describe the slivercat's unique prehensile tail, a supple, muscular, 11-foot-long weapon tipped with a hefty knob of spiked bone. The creature used its natural morning star to impale any humans who dared to trespass on its haunts. Another, less sensational variation of the slivercat legend appeared in the December 1940 issue of the magazine Minnesota History, in an article entitled Imaginary Animals of Northern Minnesota, written by Marjorie Edgar of Marine on the St. Croix, Minnesota. When I was working on the north shore of Lake Superior in 1927 and 1928, Edgar wrote, there were fantastic animals in the backwoods, even stranger than the moose and porcupines which startle the tourist from the south nowadays. Wherever I went that winter, by bus or fish truck, on the highway or on snowshoes in the woods, wherever I camped the following summer, I heard stories of these strange creatures, the folklore of our north woods. Sometimes the storyteller hoped that I might believe in the animal, as in the past the Green Rangers and Green Lumberjacks had occasionally believed. Probably the creatures were originally created to fool the listener, a stranger to the country. They were fine stories too to tell the children, and most children of that countryside knew them as they knew the Paul Bunyan tales from their fathers who were woodsmen. Edgar went on to relate some of the strange animals she was told about, including the pale snow snake, which ambushes and constricts unwary winter travelers, the whirling wampus, which snatches its prey during blizzards, and the wild tea kettle, whose high-pitched hisses could be heard in the woods. After describing the mischief wrought by the Argo pelter, a small creature which hid in hollow trees and hurled pieces of wood at passing pedestrians, Edgar wrote, living in the same deep woods, but far less dangerous, is the sliver cat, also called the splinter cat, which breaks off pieces of wood with slivery ends and throws them across the trails. The sliver cat looks a little like a porcupine, with its spines pointing the wrong way. In the summer of 1995, in the storied waters of the St. Lawrence River, a Mohawk fisherman and his grandfather came face to face with a monster that their people had spoken of for generations, an enormous horned serpent said to dwell in the frigid depths of Lake Ontario and its adjoining waterways. This chilling encounter breathes modern life into an ancient legend, which happens to be bolstered by a rich yet little-known catalog of historic reports, giving definite form to the murk of mythology, and completing a disturbing chain which unites ancestral nightmares with the waking present. I received this fascinating first-hand report in the spring of 2024 from a man named Brant McGregor, who lives in the southern banks of the St. Lawrence River, just southwest of Montreal. Mr. McGregor is a member of the Gahnawaga Band, a unique branch of the Mohawk First Nation, which broke from the powerful Iroquois Confederacy to ally with the French during the bloody Beaver Wars of the 17th century. In the 1660s, these people established a village of Gahnawaga, from which they took their name, on the southern banks of the St. Lawrence River, opposite Montreal's Lachine Seigneury, a settlement which exists today as the Gahnawaga First Nations Reserve. On May 2, 2024, a son of this singular First Nation reached out to me to tell the following story. I'm from the Mohawk Reservation on the south shore of the St. Lawrence Seaway called Gahnawaga, the storyteller wrote. We have a very long history of stories of giant water serpents in our river. McGregor proceeded to relate how, one hot summer day in July 1995, he and his grandfather prepared to head out in the St. Lawrence for a day of fishing. Before embarking in the old Mohawk's 20-foot-long open-top fishing boat, the pair were approached by the storyteller's grandmother, who solemnly cautioned them to watch out for giant snakes, an earnest but unusual entreaty, which the two fishermen dismissed as a joke. It was a very hot and sunny day, McGregor continued, with a light breeze blowing. The water was pretty calm for that area, near the mouth of the Chateauguay River. We were trolling against the current, until we decided to drop anchor 30 feet from shore, in an area us locals call Big Fence. We had been casting our lines out for 15 minutes, when I saw an object I thought was a log or tree suddenly burst to the surface. It was like one of those boogie boards people use to float around on in a pool. If you were to hold it underwater, then let it fly up to break the surface. McGregor drew his grandfather's attention towards the strange object, and the two men peered intently at the disturbance. As the water settled down, McGregor continued, we were able to get a clear look at what had risen from the bottom. It was no log or tree. The creature was about 100 feet away from our boat, and about 30 feet from shore. A huge snake-like head protruded 8 to 10 feet out of the water. The creature was dark brown with black blotches, exactly like a waterlogged dead tree or log. It was as thick as a telephone pole around. The head again was very snake-like, with 2 huge black eyes, and 2 horn-like spikes coming out the top of its head. When it came to the surface, it looked like it was lost or confused. It was looking around left and right, trying to get its bearings, when it stuck out an enormous purple forked tongue, about 5 feet long. At that moment, it noticed our boat, and it lowered down like a submarine periscope until we could only see the head and nostrils and horns above water. It swam rapidly toward our small boat. As we frantically tried to reel up our line and pull up the anchor, it came to within 20 feet of us, and it again rose out of the water and stuck out its long purple tongue. I said to my grandfather, "It wants to get in the boat." It looked at us with its huge eyes. My grandfather at last pulled up the anchor, and we made a swift exit. At no time did I see the entire body. However, judging from the size of the head and neck, I would estimate it was anywhere between 50 to 65 feet long. The monstrous head could have swallowed me in one gulp. I have only told a small group of friends and family about this incident since 1995. Shortly after relating this experience to me, McGregor generously provided me with a traditional Gachnawaga Mohawk belief regarding the giant water snake of the St. Lawrence, which he learned from his grandmother. I was told that these creatures lay eggs on land, not too far into the forest or swamp area, he wrote. Also, they are able to travel great distances over land, usually at night to avoid detection. They travel mostly when they are small and harder to notice. I was also told the newly hatched young have a metallic blue color to them that is bright in the sun. The creature also has the power to create storms in rough seas. He is like an elemental primal being, very ancient and powerful. He can come into your dreams. I can attest to that. Since my encounter, my dreams have been haunted by this creature, so much so that I had to consult a medicine man for some advice and help. I was told that, because I had seen him, now he knows me and prowls my dreams, looking for me to enter his watery domain. The Mohawk are not the only Iroquois people with traditional stories about giant underwater snakes. Although most Haudenosaunee legends regarding these mysterious creatures specifically describe a monster in Lake Ontario, which stories we will explore more thoroughly in the future, others allude to creatures that make their homes in unspecified lakes and rivers throughout the Laurentian Northwoods. West of traditional Mohawk territory, beyond the ancestral homeland of the Oneida, lies the historic domain of the Onondaga, another Iroquois tribe, which stretches from the southeastern shores of Lake Ontario to the hills of northern Pennsylvania. In her 1883 book, Myths of the Iroquois, American anthropologist Erminie Adele Smith touted the world's first female field ethnographer included an Onondaga legend in which he knew the thunder god asked a human hunter to help him slay a giant water snake. A hunter in the woods was once caught in a thunder shower, Smith wrote, when he heard a voice calling upon him to follow. This he did until he found himself in the clouds, the height of many trees from the ground. Beings which seemed to be men surrounded him, with one among them who seemed to be their chief. He was told to look below and tell whether he could see a huge water serpent. Replying that he could not, the old man anointed his eyes, after which he could see the monster in the depths below him. They then ordered one of their number to try and kill this enemy to the human race. Upon his failing, the hunter was told to accomplish the feat. He accordingly drew his bow and killed the foe. He was then conducted back to the place where he had sought shelter from the storm, which had now ceased. This was man's first acquaintance with the thunder god and his assistants, and by it he learned that they were friendly toward the human race, and protected it from dragons, serpents, and other enemies. Another Iroquois nation with traditional stories about horned water snakes is the Seneca, whose ancestral homeland lies south of Lake Ontario, beyond the territory of their easterly kinsmen, the Cayuga. American anthropologist Arthur Caswell Parker, a New Yorker of Seneca descent, included several such stories in his 1923 book, Seneca Myths and Folktales. One of these stories incorporates two strangely universal motifs common to native folklore across the continent, namely the enmity between thunder beings and great horned water snakes, and the latter's penchant for seducing native women and carrying them off to their watery abodes. Horned snake, Parker began, Gashaistawane, has several names, among which are Dunakgaze and Anjikwado. He is a monster serpent of the underwaters, and his head is adorned with antlers of great spread, though he is also said to have monster horns shaped like a buffalo's. He is capable of transforming himself into the appearance of a man, and as such delights in luring maidens to his abode. In a few instances, he appears as the gallant rescuer of women marooned on bewitched islands. Like other monsters, he has a brood of his kind, he having females as well. These sometimes lure men underwater, and seek to transform them by inducing them to put on the garments they wear. Horned Snake is hated by the Thunderer, who spares no energy to kill him before he can dive. Parker went on to relate an old Seneca story about a maiden who entertained two rival suitors, one of them Hino the Thunderer, and the other a mysterious handsome stranger with strange clothes and a crafty look. The maiden succumbed to the wiles of the newcomer and agreed to become his wife. One night, she absconded with him, accompanying him to his strange dimly lit lodge, located in an underwater cave in a lakeside cliff. The walls of this lacustrine lair were lined with strange-looking garments, from among which the stranger urged the girl to choose one that pleased her. For a long time, Parker wrote, the girl looked at the things in the lodge, but she was afraid to put on anything, for everything had such a fishy smell. There was one dress, however, that attracted the girl, and she was tempted to put it on. It was very long and had a train. It was covered all over with decorations that looked like small porcupine quills flattened out. There was a hood fastened to it, and to the hood was fastened long branching antlers. She looked at this dress longingly, but hung it up again with a sigh, for it smelled like fish, and she was afraid. The girl informed her new husband of her inclination, and of her misgivings. The mysterious husband approved of her choice, and expressed his desire for her to wear the antlered dress when he returned from his next hunting trip. The next day, Parker continued, the husband went away, again promising soon to return. Again, the girl busied herself with looking at the trophies hanging in the lodge. She noticed that there were many suits like the one she had admired. Carefully, she examined each, and then it dawned upon her that these garments were the clothing of great serpents. She was horrified at the discovery, and resolved to escape. As she went to the door, she was swept back by a wave. She tried the back door, but was forced into the lodge again by the water. Finally mustering all her courage, she ran out of the door and jumped upward. She knew that she had been in a house underwater. Soon she came to the surface, but it was dark, and there were thunderclouds in the sky. A great storm was coming. Then she heard a great splashing, and through the water she saw a monster serpent plowing his way toward her. Its eyes were fiercely blazing, and there were horns upon its head. As it came toward her, she scrambled in dismay up the dark, slippery rocks to escape it. As the lightning flashed, she looked sharply at the creature and saw that its eyes were those of her husband. She noticed in particular a certain mark on his eyes that had before strangely fascinated her. Then she realized that this was her husband, and that he was a great horned serpent. She screamed and sought to scale the cliff with redoubled vigor, but the monster was upon her with a great hiss. His huge bulk coiled to embrace her, when there was a terrific peal of thunder, a blinding flash, and the serpent fell dead, stricken by one of Hino's arrows. Hino the Thunderer picked the girl up and carried her to her father's lodge, telling her that he had been searching for her, but had been thwarted by the great horned serpent's powerful magic. He then asked the girl whether she had tried on any of the Snake Man's strange garments, telling her that to do so would have substantially transformed her from a woman to a serpent, and was pleased to learn that she had heeded her instincts to resist the temptation. Hino then purified the woman in a sweat lodge, in which she gave birth to 2 young snakes. That accomplished, the Thunderer married the widow, and gave her fellow tribesmen scales from the back of the horned serpent, which would protect them from the monster's predations as long as they kept them in their medicine bundles. Later in his book, Parker included another Seneca story, featuring a beautiful young wife who inspired jealousy in her 3 sisters. One day, the sisters brought the woman to an island in a lake on the pretext of picking huckleberries. While the young wife was busy harvesting, the three sisters quietly slipped back into the canoe and returned to their village, leaving the subject of their envy marooned on the island. When the wife discovered her sister's deception, she sat down on the beach and cried herself to sleep. That night, she was awakened by the hushed whispers of a council of what appeared to be elemental spirits, who huddled together in a ring nearby, arguing amongst themselves over which of them would rescue the marooned damsel. A tall, slender being, with a clear, ringing voice, was selected for the task. The following morning, the wife awoke to the voice of a great serpent calling out to her from the water, its head adorned with a pair of curved horns akin to that of the buffalo. The monster declared that it had come to rescue her, and advised her to take a seat upon its head so that it could convey her to shore. The wife did as requested, bringing a dozen willow branches with her at the creature's insistence with which to whip the monster if it traveled too slowly. With an undulating motion, Parker wrote, his long glistening body moved through the ripples, but the wife sat high, not a drop of water spattered upon her. As her mysterious rescuer journeyed his way, the anthropologist continued, he told her that he must hasten with all speed, as he belonged to the race of underwater people whom the mighty Hino hates. Even now, the scouts, small black clouds, might have spied him and be scudding through the sky, bringing after them a host of thunderclouds. Nor was his an idle surmise, for scarcely had he spoken when a small black cloud appeared and sped with great rapidity toward them. Instantly, the wind commenced to blow, and the great serpent called back to his charge, "Whip me, oh whip me! Hino has discovered us, and is driving onward his warriors." A terrible thunderstorm soon fell upon the woman and her monstrous rescuer. Terrified of the lightning bolts that flashed ever nearer, the horned serpent abandoned his charge and dove to the depths of the lake, leaving the woman to flounder in the water. Fortunately, the wife managed to swim the rest of the way to shore, where she was reunited with her husband. When the story of her plight became known, her three betrayers were banished from the village. According to Canadian anthropologist Gordon M. Day, in his 1978 contribution to the Handbook of North American Indians, the Iroquois shared their belief in giant horned water snakes with their easterly enemies, the Western Abenaki, who lived along both banks of the St. Lawrence River between the Richelieu River and Trois-Rivières. Like the Iroquois, the Abenaki generally regarded these creatures as malevolent. Native peoples were not the only residents of the Laurentian Valley, with tales of giant serpents in the St. Lawrence. For as long as they have sailed that great Canadian waterway, French colonists and their French-Canadian descendants have had their own stories about a remarkably similar creature, an enormous aquatic horse-headed serpent. Gallic reports of this riparian reptile accord perfectly with the Old World legend of the hippocampus, or seahorse, regional variations of which exist across Europe and the Middle East. French reports of a monster in the St. Lawrence date back as early as 1835, during Breton explorer Jacques Cartier's second voyage to Canada on behalf of King Francis I of France. Guided by two St. Lawrence Iroquois princes whom they had kidnapped on the Gaspé Peninsula the previous year, Cartier and his sailors became the first white men to explore the great waterway that would become the heart of French Canada. On August 20th, 1835, the explorers embarked on their jolly boats and made a brief excursion up the Moisey River, a tributary of the St. Lawrence, formerly known as Chesadec, which empties into the northern St. Lawrence Delta near present-day Sept-Îles, Quebec, just northwest of Anticosti Island. Up this river, Cartier wrote in the relation of his second voyage, were several fish in appearance like horses, which go on land at night, but in the daytime remain in the water, as our two Indians informed us. We saw a great number of these fish up this river. Cartier alluded to these creatures several more times in his writings, repeatedly referring to them as chevaux de mer, or sea horses, a term evoking the hippocampi of Old World lore. Although some writers have identified these mysterious amphibians as walruses, this classification is called into question by an illustration in a mysterious handwritten document known today as the Codex Canadensis. Originally supposed to have been penned around the turn of the 18th century by Charles Bécard de Granville et de Fonville, a celebrated cartographer from Quebec City, this document is now believed to have been composed by Father Louis Nicolas, a French Jesuit missionary celebrated for his contributions to the field of natural history, and criticized for his fiery temper. On page 40 of his manuscript, Nicolas drew an image of a creature with the head of a horse and the tail of a fish, to which he added the French caption, "Seahorse seen in the meadows along the river Chesadec, which flows into the St. Lawrence River." Later in his relation of his second voyage, Jacques Cartier described another unusual discovery that he and his men made on September 2, 1835, at the mouth of the Saguenay River, a tributary of the St. Lawrence characterized by imposing fjord-like cliffs, which the Iroquois claimed led to a fabulous kingdom, rich in gold and precious stones. His description of this discovery, as it appears in a 1580 English translation of his writings, reads, "Next morning we hoisted sail and went thence, sailing further on, where we had notice of a certain kind of fish, never tofore of any man seen or known. They are about the bigness of a porpoise, yet nothing like them, of body very well proportioned, headed like greyhounds, altogether as white as snow, without any spot, within which river there is a great quantity of them. They do live altogether between the sea and the fresh water. These of the country call them adothes. They told us that they be very savoury and good to be eaten. Moreover, they affirm none to be found elsewhere but in that river." Most academics who have commented upon this passage have identified adothes as white whales or beluga whales, which live in the brackish waters of the St. Lawrence Delta. This interpretation, while geographically accurate, betrays either total disregard for Cartier's description or an utter ignorance of beluga anatomy, as belugas bear undeniable resemblance to porpoises and have bulbous heads antithetical to the slender crania of greyhounds. On July 3, 1608, more than 7 decades after Cartier's second voyage to Canada, French explorer Samuel de Champlain established the settlement of Quebec near the site of Charlesbourg Royal, an abandoned colony which Cartier had established in 1541 near an old Iroquois village that he had visited during his exploration of the St. Lawrence. Over the succeeding decades, French adventurers would establish the settlements of Trois-Rivières and Montreal further upriver, forming the colony of Canada, the jewel of New France. For a century and a half, the little Laurentian colony maintained its precarious existence in the face of much larger foes, repelling incursions of the powerful Iroquois Confederacy during the Beaver Wars of the 17th century, and withstanding the assaults of the English throughout the continent's 4 great intercolonial wars. The British conquered New France in 1760, during the 7 Years' War, ushering in a new era of Anglo-Saxon rule in Canada. All throughout, the St. Lawrence River served as the stage on which this multi-generational drama unfolded, being the backdrop against which habitants tilled their narrow seigneuries, the aquatic highway on which furs, munitions, passengers, and mail were regularly trafficked, and the battlefield on which the fate of the continent was decided. If any of the farmers, priests, soldiers, or sailors who traversed the waters of Le Grand Fleuve during the 17th and 18th centuries left written records of their encounters with giant water snakes, this author is unaware of them. It wasn't until the early 19th century that run-ins with the river's mysterious serpentine inmate began to circulate by way of the press. The earliest journalistic reference to a giant serpent in the St. Lawrence Valley that this author was able to unearth is neither a sea serpent story nor a true tale. Filed away in the Gary Mungia Cooper archives is an old newspaper clipping, apparently acquired by the New Hampshire Historical Society, taken from the July 29, 1826 issue of the Portsmouth Journal. A late Montreal paper, the article began, gives an account of a snake, first seen by a woman and some children, and afterwards by several men, which, when twisted around a tree 30 feet in height, reached from the bottom to the top of it, and appeared to be as big round as a common water pail. A horse, 6 or 7 neat cattle, and some sheep are missing from the neighborhood, a place called Jean-Baptiste, and of course he is charged with having carried them all off for his own eating. The Montreal editor does not seem to doubt the truth of the story, as his information is derived from the owner of the ground in which his snake ship was seen, corroborated by half a dozen men who had looked on while he glided through the grass and over plowed land to hide himself in a wood. We should be very loath to have such gentry lurking around our premises. Exactly 3 weeks later, the same publication threw cold water on its own story by stating that the report was a hoax perpetrated by a farmer from the village of L'Assomption, just down the St. Lawrence from Montreal, who had accidentally discovered an extensive plat of strawberries on his land and concocted the snake story in order to deter his neighbors from availing themselves of it. The St. Lawrence Serpent's first real newspaper debut is more properly a story describing a monster in Lake Ontario, a creature which features heavily in the legends of the Huron and the Seneca, with which the St. Lawrence water snake is inextricably intertwined. On July 15, 1835, a Kingston newspaper printed the report of Captain Abaya Kellogg of Sackett's Harbor, New York, who claimed to have encountered something unusual during a routine voyage from Rochester, New York to Kingston, Upper Canada, now Kingston, Ontario. At about 7 o'clock in the evening, while completing the last leg of his journey across Lake Ontario, Captain Kellogg spied something strange from the deck of his schooner Polyphemus, a strange pole-like object lying still in the water, which he first took to be the severed mast of a sailing ship. Observing it more attentively, the article explained, he was surprised and alarmed to see it in motion and steering towards the schooner. Singing out to his hands to take care of themselves, he put the schooner up to the wind, lashed the helm alee, and ran up the main rigging, waiting for the monster to approach. The serpent, for it was no other than an immense snake, neared the vessel fast and passed immediately under the stern, taking no notice whatever of the schooner or those on board, but affording to everybody an ample opportunity to observe and note his monstrous dimensions. In length, he was about 175 feet, of a dark blue color, spotted with brown. Towards either end he tapered off, but about the middle, his body was of the circumference of a flour barrel. His head was peculiarly small, and could not be well distinguished but from the direction in which he moved. He swam with an undulating movement, keeping the best part of his body under water, but occasionally showing his entire length. He was in sight full 15 minutes, and when last seen, was making the best of his way down the St. Lawrence. On board the schooner were 2 young men, the vessel's crew, together with 3 passengers, who are all willing to be qualified to the truth of what has been here stated. More than 2 decades elapsed before the monster serpent of the St. Lawrence returned to Canadian headlines. On May 28, 1857, the Kingston Whig Standard ran with a story describing the sighting of an enormous water serpent about 3 miles of the St. Lawrence from the city of Brockville, Canada, now Brockville, Ontario, the latter lying about 70 kilometers northeast of Kingston. 2 witnesses, Mr. L. Parker and Mr. D. Ladd, had their boating excursion cut short by the appearance of a 30-foot-long snake. The frightening creature, which was lightly colored, reared 6 feet out of the water and charged at the boaters, spurring them into a mad dash for shore. The incident was corroborated by crew members of the schooner Protection, who witnessed the event from a distance. The next chronological sighting of the swimming serpent of the St. Lawrence was referenced in the 1937 French-language book Légendes et récits de la côte nord du Saint-Laurent, or Legends and Tales of the North Shore of the St. Lawrence. This publication was written by Eliosa Fafard-Lacaze, whose family manned the Pointe de Mont lighthouse on the northern shores of the St. Lawrence Delta throughout the latter half of the 19th century. With the exception of the blue behemoth reported by Captain Kellogg, the monstrous creature which Eliosa described differs considerably from the 30-foot-long serpent reportedly seen upriver, strongly implying that the water snakes seen in the upper St. Lawrence and the colossi reported in the Gulf constitute separate phenomena. A sea monster was reportedly seen by Monsieur Pierre Comeau, Eliosa wrote, referring to the brother of a famous trapper from the southwesterly village of Godbout, Quebec. It appeared to him one day while he was hunting, opposite the lighthouse, close enough for him to fire his weapon at it. The monster did not move. He noticed that it resembled a snake in the way it undulated on the surface of the water. Its head, which it held raised, had an enormous mouth. Its body was the size of an ox, and its length, according to the witness, was about 80 feet. Surprised that the gunshot had not disturbed the snake, Monsieur Comeau, seized with fear, decided it would be safer to move away. Comeau himself, at the urging of a Roman Catholic priest named Father Victor Amédée Huard, wrote down his recollection of the incident. This first-hand account was published in the November 1895 issue of the Canadian Naturalist, and republished in Father Huard's 1897 French-language book, Labrador at Anticosti. The site of his encounter was a spot in the St. Lawrence called Les Îles Caribou, located roughly halfway between Godbout and Sept-Îles. On December 19, 1884, Comeau wrote in French, "A man named David Picard and his son reported to me that they had seen a fish about 100 feet long and about 4 feet wide. We thought it was a joke, and no one paid any attention to it, until in 1885, during the same month, the same David Picard, accompanied by a man named Thomas Jourdain, saw the same monster again, but still too far away to give a very accurate description. That same winter, on the 26th of January, to my great satisfaction, I was able to convince myself of the truth of these reports. I saw this monster at a distance of 300 yards. It was standing in a pool of water, surrounded by ice, sleeping on the water, appearing to warm itself in the sun, for the weather was exceptionally fine for the season. About 40 feet of the animal floated on the surface of the water, and probably much more was not visible. Here is the position in which I saw this extraordinary fish, seeing neither head nor tail, but only these two lumps. I examined it there for a couple of hours, regretting greatly that I could not approach it because of the ice, which I could not pass through, being in a small boat of 12 feet, a vessel used in winter in the ice for hunting seals, or sea wolves as they are called here. In February of the same year, I saw it again, and several others saw it too. It was leaping out of the water, straight up into the air, its head rising about 50 feet high, leaving the water for who knows how long. It made 4 leaps in this manner, rising straight out of the water and falling flat on the surface. In March, several of us saw it again. Finally, on April 14th, the last time I saw it, it appeared to be sleeping on the water, in the same position where I saw it the first time. The weather was fine, calm and mild, very favorable for my plan, so I decided to approach it and fire a few shots at it. We set off in 2 boats, but when we were 300 yards away, the people in the boat accompanying me were seized by fear and turned back. I approached it at a distance of 30 feet without it moving. When I got there, the animal began to submerge itself, tail first, until only part of its head remained above the water, that is, the upper jaw, its mouth open at least 10 feet high. I did not see the lower jaw. What I found most monstrous and horrible was the eye, which seemed to me to be enormous and so malicious as to make one tremble. I was about to fire when it took a threatening position, and without giving an inch, stood with its mouth open, seemingly waiting to see what we were going to do. I then thought it would be more prudent not to attack it, as I was not equipped for such a hunt. We moved away, and it disappeared, never to be seen again. Its skin was black in color, with hard-looking scales. The tail was like a whale's, flat in the direction of the water. That is the detail I can give you to the best of my knowledge. Please excuse the scribble and the description, which is accurate but insufficient. Pierre Z. Comeau. This story was partly corroborated by Elios's uncle, E. Fafard, in a later newspaper interview. This uncle, however, identified the witness as Pierre's brother, Napoleon Alexandre Comeau, a fishery overseer for the Dominion government. Mr. Alex Comeau, he said, a Dominion government fishery inspector, has seen it many times. Once he got near enough to take a shot at it, but he got frightened and ran away. Barring the possibility that both brothers had a similar experience, this identification is called into question not only by Pierre's testimony, but also by Alex Comeau himself, who neglected to mention the incident in his 1909 book, Life and Sport on the North Shore, a reminiscence on his hunting adventures on the northern shores of the Gulf of St. Lawrence. This monster was reportedly seen again on many occasions and in different places along the coast, Eliosa continued in her book. However, no one has ever had the courage to try to capture or kill it. It is reported that during the time of Monsieur Wallace, the first keeper of the Pointe de Mont lighthouse, an entire family disappeared a few yards from the lighthouse at a place called Anse-à-la-Morue. As this family was traveling in a bark canoe, it was assumed that they had been attacked and devoured by the monster in question. Accidents of this kind were very common on the North Shore, since all transportation was by water, either by canoe or rowboat. For example, Madame Meade, whom we already know, had a married son named Thuse. One evening in the autumn of 1872, he set out in a canoe with his wife and a friend to spend the night at the nearest neighbor's house, a few miles away. They never returned, and their bodies were never found, which further reinforced the belief in the existence of this sea monster. Elios's uncle, E. Fafard, elaborated on the monster in a later interview, excerpts of which were published in the January 26, 1912 issue of the Toronto Star. I was born and raised at Pointe de Mont, he said, and lived here for many years, and I have seen the sea serpent many times. Every 12 or 15 years, it comes up out of the water, and stays around for a week or so at a time. For over 45 years, the lighthouse has been in our family, and my father and I have repeatedly watched the serpent, apparently sunning itself on the surface of the water, having come up through thin ice or between the floating blocks. It appeared to be about 100 feet in length, each of 3 or 4 undulations being about 20 feet apart. The monster had a terrible appearance, being about 50 feet in girth. Fafard went on to explain that the monster seen by residents of the so-called North Shore only ever appeared in winter, revealing another discrepancy between the creature of the Gulf and the summer-loving serpent spotted further upriver. In 1880, a flurry of sightings were reported in Montreal and at the mouth of the Richelieu River. The river's mysterious inhabitant was spotted again in the summer of 1887, generating excitement in the village of Tadoussac, Quebec, at the mouth of the Saguenay River, where Jacques Cartier had spotted the greyhound-headed Adothes 352 years earlier. The following summer, it appeared several times in a vast archipelago at the head of the St. Lawrence, known as the Thousand Islands. Early in June, declared an article in the July 25, 1888 issue of the Kingston Whig Standard, some men who were out in a sailboat near Kingston saw what they believed to be a serpent about 30 feet long. Another article, published in the August 9th issue of Kingston's Weekly British Whig, elaborated on this sighting, dating it to July 10th, setting it near Simcoe Island, just south of Kingston, and identifying the witness as Charles Staley and 4 others who were out sailing, the Staleys being well-known and respected farmers. Nearly 2 months later, in late July, a New York fisherman named C.W. Sykes had an unnerving experience in the narrow channel between Round Island and the New York shore, the former lying just northeast of the village of Clayton. While rowing his boat near a shoreline marsh, Sykes saw something large and black moving rapidly along the surface of the water. At first, he thought it was a duck or some other species of water bird, explained the July 25th article, but nothing of the sort. It was, as he believes, the head of a water serpent of enormous size. The head was at least 8 inches across the top and stuck out of the water a foot or more. The head went under when the boat was about 40 yards from it. As it disappeared, the water was ruffled by the serpent's tail at least 30 feet from the spot. The serpent did not reappear, but the men who saw it believe it has not left that part of the river. They give it as their opinion that the serpent was at least 6 inches in diameter and 30 feet long. Since they reported their discovery, all the young ladies on the islands refuse to go out in anything but steam yachts having high gunwales, and skiff owners are taking a rest. About a week later, on August 4th, 1888, the creature was spotted again near Milton Island, just off the southeastern outskirts of Kingston. The witnesses were 18-year-old locals Charles Hora and Henry Cartwright, the latter being the son of Canadian politician Sir Richard Cartwright. Henry Cartwright described the experience to the press, saying, "On Saturday evening, Charles Hora and myself went out in a canoe toward Milton Island, about 6 miles down from here. The weather was pleasant and the air quiet. At about 8 o'clock, it was yet light. I was sitting in the bow of the canoe. I first saw what I thought was another canoe, with 3 persons in it, as there were 3 lumps projecting out of the water, and peering only indistinctly, concluded that 3 persons were sitting in the canoe. We were paddling along about 10 feet from shore, and as the object was some distance ahead, we thought we would chase it. It suddenly turned around and was making from shore toward us. It came up within 20 feet of the bow of the canoe, when we saw it was no canoe. We sat in wonder, thinking someone was playing a scare on us. The dog in our canoe barked wildly at the animal, and we concluded it must be the sea serpent recently seen, which we had heard so much about. The monster passed us so close when we stopped that we could see him distinctly, and judged him to be at least 15 feet long. He was 6 feet out of the water. I am sure it was no seal or fish I ever saw. It looked too snaky. When he disappeared, after remaining in sight 4 or 5 minutes and moving very rapidly, we started off, lest he might upset the canoe. I will admit that we were considerably frightened. As he disappeared, he switched his tail violently, making a loud report. At first, we thought we would chase him, but afterwards we thought not. The article in which Cartwright's testimony appeared stated that locals believe the serpent fed on the carcasses of dead animals thrown along the shore by farmers, the bones of which were found picked clean shortly thereafter by some mysterious riverside scavenger. The serpent continued to harass residents of the Thousand Islands in the latter years of the 19th century, colliding with two young ladies in a rowboat near Navy Bay, just southeast of Kingston, in May 1889, and showing its horse-like head and 30-foot-long body to witnesses near the village of Alexandria Bay, New York, just downriver of Round Island, in November 1892. In the summer of 1895, a specimen was supposedly killed and put on display in Montreal, where the interested public could admire it for an admission price of 10 cents. On the urging of a professor at McGill University, a police investigation promptly revealed that the subject of the exhibition was a fabrication, composed of a cotton sack filled with sawdust, covered with plaster of Paris and black wax, complete with leather fins and eyes of yellow glass. The orchestrators of the hoax fled to the United States before they could be prosecuted. In the summer of 1902, the river monster appeared to a group of rowboat-going seal hunters in the waters off Sept-Îles, Quebec, where Jacques Cartier had seen water horses 337 years earlier. The hunters, whose number included a physician named Dr. Dobbin and a pulp factory foreman named Maurice Power, described the creature as having a seal-like head and initially mistook it for their quarry. Upon their approach, however, the animal reared about 15 feet out of the water, revealing a slimy green serpentine body, which they estimated to have a length of between 60 to 100 feet, covered with scales and encrusted with barnacles. When the serpent advanced on the rowboat, with mouth agape and fangs glistening, Power fired his revolver at it, sending it into writhing convulsions that agitated the water. The monster then dove down, swam beneath the rowboat, and surfaced briefly on the other side before retreating to the depths. The creature continued to appear with casual frequency throughout the 20th century. In the winter of 1911 and 1912, it was spotted twice by the father of Eliose Fafard Lacasse, the keeper of the Pointe de Mont lighthouse. In June 1934, it was seen by broker Ross Malcolm, Major J. M. Humphreys of the Canadian Militia, and insurance broker Henry de Kuiper. "We were crossing the second bridge of the island of Montreal," Malcolm told the press, "when I noticed something very large on the surface of the river. I called the attention of my friends to the thing, explaining it must be a seal, but then the creature stuck its head way up out of the water, and we saw it was no seal. It's a sea serpent," was the conclusion we came to, for it looked exactly like the picture of the sea serpent washed up on the shores of France a month or two ago. I am not a drinking man, and that somewhat trite explanation will not suffice in this case. Indeed, none of the party had a drink, so that cannot be brought against us, although we probably shall have to take a lot of kidding. 2 years later, an enormous grey creature was spotted near the rapids of Long Sault, roughly halfway between Montreal and the Thousand Islands. Locals of the nearby villages of Cornwall, Ontario, and Massena, New York, affectionately christened the creature Oscar. Although many identified the animal as a seal, anomalous in that part of the St. Lawrence, others proposed that it might be the legendary river serpent. Our last story is a Mohawk legend told by the grandmother of Brant McGregor, whose frightening experience in 1995 marked the beginning of this piece. The legend describes an event that took place sometime in the early 1900s, before the construction of the St. Lawrence Seaway in the 1950s, which broke the upper St. Lawrence into a system of locks and canals that allows sea-going vessels to access the Great Lakes. Evoking the old Seneca legend of the maiden who was tempted to don the transformative garment of the water serpent, this story tells of a young boy who succumbed to the magic of the horned snakes and became one of them. Before the St. Lawrence Seaway was constructed, McGregor wrote, Gachnawaga had direct access to the river from the north end of our territory. There were docks, wharfs, and beaches where our people enjoyed the river. There was a young boy, around 10 years old, named Saran Kwesen. He used to love to go down and play by the river all by himself. He was told not to go near the river alone because it was dangerous. His mother warned him about the great maned, bearded, horned serpent that had been seen recently by some local fishermen. This only piqued his interest even more. Now more determined than ever to go to the river and get a glimpse of the creature, he set off by himself one sunny summer morning. When he arrived at the river, after a short walk, he noticed some other children throwing rocks into the water off in the distance. It seemed like a good idea, so he began to throw some small stones into the river. Suddenly, Only a stone's throw's distance from where Saranquisen was standing, the water began to violently bubble and churn. Then out of the froth emerged a huge maned serpent with a beard and horns. Saranquisen was terror-struck. He could not move a muscle. There he stood, frozen, as the monster slowly approached him. It came to within an arm's length of the poor boy. It glared at him with its huge eyes, unblinking. Slowly, Saranquisen began to wade into the water towards the giant serpent. He had become hypnotized by the gaze of the beast. He swam up to the creature, who turned its great back to the boy, which the boy quickly mounted, climbing up the great brown mane that ran along the back of the creature's head, and twisting his hands into the creature's hair to get a grip on the beast. At once, the giant serpent dove under the water and swam along the surface in an undulating manner. Every time his great head broke the surface, Saranquisen, his passenger, became visible, tightly grasping the monster's head and neck with his arms and legs. He was never seen again in Gahnawaga, though legend has it he was sighted off the coast of Cornwall Island, Ontario, by some local Akwesasne Mohawks. Grant McGregor's 1995 sighting of a huge horned water snake near Montreal links these historic encounters, and the native legends which precede them, to the living present, indicating that the massive undulating denizen of the St. Lawrence, whatever it is, might still be out there. So the next time you find yourself in the Laurentian Valley, keep your eyes peeled. You never know what might float up to the surface. Over the course of my 9-year career delving into the mysteries of the Great White North, I've made a handful of discoveries that actually gave me goosebumps. In 2016, I thought I correctly deciphered and interpreted a code that I found in an obscure family history, which I believe pointed to a treasure buried on New Brunswick's Grand Manan Island. In 2017, while doing research for my book Legends of the Nahanni Valley, I came across the story of a man who shot an Akani, or Northern Wild Man, in the forgotten letters of a northern frontiersman named Poole Field. In 2018, I located and interviewed Frank Graves, a semi-legendary character whose northern adventures spawned 2 of the legends in my aforementioned book, from whom I acquired footage that was supposed to have been lost. In 2019, I discovered a connection between a TV show from the 1950s and a mysterious map connected with Oak Island, Nova Scotia, the site of Canada's longest-running treasure hunt. In 2021, I observed 3 eerie similarities between old Cree Wendigo stories and traditional Roman Catholic doctrine regarding demonic possession. And in 2023, my friend Bex Coral told me about her family's encounters with a little person in Port Perry, Ontario, a strange detail of which accorded perfectly with old Ontario pixie legends that I came across in a little-known ethnological treatise. I recently got goosebumps again when comparing notes with my friend and fellow researcher Kevin Gould, author of the 2024 book An Anthology of American Strangeness Volume 1. Kevin, who has a special interest in the legendary Thunderbird photo, supposedly taken in Tombstone, Arizona in the late 1800s, had been poring over the writings of Hiram Kramer, an eccentric resident of the tiny backwoods community of Hammersley Fork, Pennsylvania, who claimed to have owned a copy of the photo before his death in a house fire in 1967. Kramer declared that the wooded hills of northern Pennsylvania sheltered a population of giant predatory birds, which he called Thunderbirds, after the legendary storm spirit common to native traditions across the continent. He attributed a handful of missing persons cases to the predations of these colossal raptors, which he believed were capable of carrying off fully grown men. In an article on his website, thunderbirdphoto.com, Kevin reproduced one of Kramer's statements regarding the predatory behavior of these avian behemoths, writing,
"The Thunderbird seizes its victim by the shoulders, flies to a bare hilltop, where it places its victim on its back, then rips open the belly, begins eating while the victim is alive. Then it pecks a hole in the skull and eats the brains. Then, if it is still hungry, it eats the meat."
Kramer reiterated his belief in the Thunderbird's skull-pecking proclivities to Al Bielek, a protege of cryptozoology godfather Ivan T. Sanderson, who would go on to gain notoriety for his extraordinary claims regarding secret U.S. military tests, like the supposed Philadelphia experiment and Project Montauk. In 1963, 36-year-old Bielek, at Sanderson's request, interviewed an elderly Kramer in his remote cabin in the Pennsylvania hills. Bielek described the experience in a letter to Sanderson, writing,
Mr. C was very talkative. Says he has seen many Thunderbirds since approximately 1899, his first. He described in detail the disappearance of several local inhabitants over the years, from old men to a young child, a girl of about 4 who was left alone for a few minutes by her sister while berry picking. The girl was not recovered or found. An old junk dealer traveling alone in the fog disappeared from his wagon and was not found. In 1 or 2 instances, the skeletons were found much later, invariably on a high and barren hilltop. They had been consumed, and apparently, from his descriptions, included boring the skull to devour the brain.
The notion of a skull-pecking Thunderbird reminded me of a pair of old legends that I touched on in my 2019 book, Mysteries of Canada Volume 1, regarding a mysterious vale on the southern shores of Lake Huron's Georgian Bay. If you drive 10 minutes west of the sleepy town of Collingwood, Ontario, into the Blue Mountains, you'll come to the Scenic Caves Nature Preserve. This enchanting natural area is dominated by towering cliffs, gloomy caves, and dark fissures that snake away into the rock. Centuries ago, this otherworldly vale marked the territorial boundary between the Huron Indians and the related Petun or Tobacco Nation. Both peoples avoided the place, especially after dark, believing it to be haunted by the spirits of the dead. The gateway to this village of the dead, the natives believed, was a rugged 16-meter-tall limestone spire, best known today as Standing Rock. The Huron called this edifice Ekareni Ondai, literally the rock that stands out. The first written reference to this lithic anomaly appears in the Jesuit Relations of 1636, a report written by French Jesuit missionaries in Canada to their superiors in Rome. In a chapter on Huron beliefs regarding the human soul, Jesuit missionary Father Jean de Brebeuf, who would be famously tortured to death by Iroquois 13 years later, wrote, "The souls which are stronger and more robust have their gathering place, as I have said, toward the west, where each nation has its own village." I asked one day one of our savages where they thought the village of souls was. He answered that it was toward the Tobacco Nation, that is to say, toward the west, 8 leagues from us, and that some persons had seen them as they were going, that they passed near a rock called Ekareni Ondai, which has often been found marked with the paint which they used to smear their faces. Another told me that on the same road, before arriving at the village, one comes to a cabin where lives one named Oskatarak, or Piercehead, who draws the brains out of the heads of the dead and keeps them. Tuscarora American ethnologist John Napoleon Brinton Hewitt, in an 1895 article on the Iroquoian concept of the soul, postulated on the symbolic significance behind the Oskatarak's brain-sucking operation. Hewitt first reiterated de Brebeuf's observation that the Iroquois believed that a man had 2 souls, one which resides in his bones after death, and another which travels to the village of the dead after the performance of an ossuarial ritual called the Feast of the Dead. When once the idea that the sensitive soul resided in the marrow of the bones, the most enduring part of the human body, became firmly fixed, Hewitt wrote, it was not difficult to follow this with the further doctrine that the brain, encased in by the largest bony structure of the skeleton, was the appointed seat and abiding place of the intelligent soul or spirit. The use of the war club and the battle axe would soon decide for the savage mind that reason and consciousness abide in the brain, since a blow on the head from either arm drove from the unfortunate one all reason and consciousness. Hence, it was also believed that the removal of the brains from the head rendered the sensitive or animating soul stupid and implacable, and capable of committing excesses in the way of preying on the living. This view is recognized in the common Iroquoian tradition that on the way to the land of disembodied spirits, there dwells a person called Head Opener, who makes it his business to take the brains from the dead. Some say to eat them, others to keep them. Here, Hewitt seems to be suggesting that the role of Oskatarak was to deprive ghosts of their reasoning, making them dangerous to living humans. 17th century French explorer Pierre Boucher de Grosbois, Sieur de Boucherville, who served as the governor of Trois-Rivières in the 1660s, learned a different interpretation of the head piercer's function from his Huron allies. In his posthumous 1883 book, Canada in the 17th Century, Boucher wrote that the Huron believed in the immortality of the soul, and say that after death, it goes to a beautiful country. That before it can get there, it has to pass a river, where there is one who lays open the heads of all comers, and takes out their brains so that they no longer remember anything. Here, Grosbois seems to be suggesting that the purpose of the head piercer was to eliminate any attachment a ghost might have to its former life, preparing it for eternal residence in the village of the dead. There is another indigenous legend associated with the scenic Caves Nature Preserve, which, when conjoined with the legend of the head piercer, forms a disturbing parallel with Hiram Kramer's brain-eating Thunderbird of Pennsylvania. In his 1915 book, Ojibwe Myths and Tales, Canadian cavalry officer Colonel George E. Laidlaw, a veteran of both the Northwest Rebellion and the Boer War, included a brief legend told to him by Ojibwe elder Peter York of Lake Simcoe's Rama Reserve. The old people once went to the Blue Mountains near Collingwood a long time ago, York said. At the end, near the bay, a Thunderbird had its nest. It had 2 young birds. They were shaped like geese, but were naked and were about as high as a man's chest, and were of brownish red or russet color. By and by, they began to grow pin feathers and get big. Then they went away. The old people went over several times to see them, and they first saw them during a thunderstorm. In a 1998 paper for the Batoon Research Institute Bulletin, Canadian archaeologist Charles Garrad identified the legendary Thunderbird nest in the Blue Mountains as a bowl-shaped cavity immediately adjacent to the Standing Rock, described by British-Canadian archaeologist Fred Birch in a 1904 paper as a sort of amphitheater, 40 or 50 feet in diameter. In a 2011 interview, Garrad noted that this nest-like depression is filled with egg-shaped rocks. To put it succinctly, an expert on Pennsylvania folklore believed that Thunderbirds pecked holes in the skulls of human beings in order to eat their brains, and the Ojibwe claimed that a Thunderbird kept its nest in the very same spot where the Batoon believed an entity they called the head piercer bored holes in the skulls of the dead in order to eat their brains. Is it possible that a man-eating, skull-pecking Thunderbird once lived in the Blue Mountains, and that the Batoon legend of the head piercer derived from discoveries of its grisly leavings? Or are the striking parallels between Kramer's assertions and native legends regarding the scenic Caves Nature Preserve merely coincidental? All across Canada, there are native legends, settler folktales, and modern sightings of mysterious little people endowed with preternatural abilities. The region with the greatest concentration of such tales seems to be the province of Ontario. In previous pieces, we have explored Ojibwe, Cree, and Algonquin legends about hair-covered water sprites called Memegwesawak, which are said to dwell inside the cliffs that fringe the lakes and rivers of northern Ontario's Canadian Shield. In this piece, we will delve into Iroquoian legends from the Ontario Peninsula, a populous region in southern Ontario, bounded by Lakes Ontario, Erie, and Huron, the setting of old pixie stories once told by Cornish immigrants, and the site at which some of my most intriguing subscriber encounters with little people took place. At the eastern edge of the Ontario Peninsula, from the northwestern shores of Lake Ontario, through Lake Simcoe to Lake Huron's Georgian Bay, lies the historic territory of the Huron, an Iroquoian people who once fought alongside the French during the Beaver Wars of the 17th century. In the mid-1600s, these people were virtually wiped out by their traditional enemies, the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy, a warlike alliance of 5 nations who lived in the forests of upstate New York, composed of the Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, and Mohawk. To the Huron, little people were powerful prophetic spirits who foretold the fate of warriors in impending battles. In his 1969 book, The Huron Farmers of the North, Canadian archaeologist Bruce Trigger wrote that the preternatural beings of Huron mythology appeared in human form in dreams and visions. Ondo Tete, the god of war, manifested himself as either an ugly male dwarf or as a woman. American historian Elizabeth Tooker briefly elaborated on this diminutive demi-deity in her 1964 ethnology on the Huron Indians, writing, "A sort of war god, a little dwarf, appeared to many before going to war. If he caressed them, it was a sign that they would return victorious. If he struck them on the forehead, they could go to war without losing their lives." Tooker drew this information from Volume 10 of the Jesuit Relations, the latter being reports written by French Jesuit missionaries to their superiors in Rome throughout the 17th and early 18th centuries. Her description of this entity is nearly a verbatim translation of a French passage written in 1639 by Father Paul Lejeune, superior of the Jesuits in Canada, although it contains one crucial mistake. The Jesuit wrote that those whom the dwarf struck on the forehead in their dreams can truly say that they will not go to war without losing their lives. West of traditional Huron territory, on the southern shores of Georgian Bay, lies the ancestral domain of the Petun or Tobacco Indians, members of an Iroquoian people closely related to the Huron, who would follow the latter into the graveyard of conquered nations, driven by the tomahawks and war clubs of their Haudenosaunee enemies. In his 1914 book on the supernatural beings which inhabit the folklore of this vanished people, Canadian ethnographer Marius Barbeau wrote that the Petun believed in two varieties of dwarves, namely the Tikea and the Kahinoa. The Tikea are supposed to have assisted the Petun creator, Tsetsa, in a primeval war against his brother and an army of giants, afterwards retreating to the world of souls in the west, possibly the Blue Mountains south of Georgian Bay. In the spring of 1648, 1,000 Iroquois braves, armed with arquebuses or matchlock muskets, which they had acquired from their Dutch trading partners, left their villages in the forest of upstate New York to terrorize their native enemies in the Ontario Peninsula. In 1649, they launched a devastating offensive against the Huron, razing entire villages and carrying hundreds of captives back to their own country for either adoption or ritual torture and execution. The ragged remains of the Huron nation either sheltered among their Petun cousins or fled east to the protection of their French allies. Later that year, the Iroquois turned their ravenous gaze on the Petun and summarily annihilated them, bringing survivors of their devastating raids southeast into the Laurentian Northwoods for absorption or destruction. A motley assortment of Huron and Petun who managed to escape the carnage fled northwest to the upper Great Lakes, forming a hybrid nation that would come to be known as the Wyandot. In the early 1700s, this roving people resettled in what is now southern Michigan. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, they gradually migrated further southwest, first taking up residence in Ohio, and finally relocating to Kansas under pressure from the U.S. government. Over the centuries, the Wyandot developed their own unique folklore, a product of their turbulent history and their Huron and Petun roots. In his 1899 work on this cosmology, American historian William Ellerslie Connolly, not to be confused with his homophonous namesake, who currently teaches political theory at Johns Hopkins University, described an old Wyandot legend about little people, distinct from the mythological warriors of Petun tradition and the Morphean omen of Huron myth. The Ta Thekea, or the Little People, Connolly wrote, occupy an important place in Wyandot mythology. Their name signifies the twins. They are very diminutive in size, but they possess marvelous supernatural powers. They lived, and they are supposed to yet live, in stone caves in the bowels of the earth. In these caves are forests, streams, game, night and day, heat and cold, as on the surface of the earth. These little people are represented as living precisely like the ancient Wyandot, and that it is their task, duty, and pleasure to preserve in all their primeval purity the ancient laws, customs, social organization, and political and religious institutions for the use of the Wyandots after death. For this is the land to which the Wyandots go when they leave this world. I have no space here to enumerate the many achievements of the little people. Connolly did have space to expound on these adventures in his other book on the Wyandot, also published in 1899, and apparently intended for public rather than scholarly consumption. He claimed that the Wyandot called their mysterious diminutive neighbors the twins because they were the only other creatures created by their mythological progenitor, Tsetsa, and because they were born in pairs or twins only. They never operated singly in the accomplishment of any enterprise, and only in very rare instances were more than two of them required for the performance of any task or purpose, however great or severe. Connolly went on to relate several mythological accomplishments of the little people, including the expulsion of witch buffaloes from what is now Big Bone Lick State Park in Boone County, Kentucky, where the fossils of mammoths, mastodons, and other Pleistocene giants can be found embedded in an ancient salt lick. Legend has it that the imprints of their tiny bows and arrows can still be seen in the area, embedded in the solid rock. After explaining how the little people were believed to protect the Wyandot from preternatural enemies, like the dreaded flying head of Iroquoian and Algonquian legend, Connolly elaborated on their supposed abilities, which are eerily consistent with those of other legendary little people that populate indigenous folktales across Canada. They have the power to enter and pass through solid rock, he wrote, and they always pass through living rock in returning to their subterranean home. And this home is pictured as one of ideal beauty, according to the Indian standard, but no one in all the realms of Indian imagination, natural or supernatural, ever has or ever can see this beautiful country except the little people, until after death, when it is to be also the abode of the Wyandot. In 1665, King Louis XIV of France dispatched his battle-hardened regiment of Carignan-Salliers to New France to put an end to the Iroquois threat. The French regulars, who had seen action in the 30 Years and Austro-Turkish Wars, marched into Iroquois territory and razed several abandoned Mohawk villages, whose fearful inhabitants had fled into the woods. After bearing the brunt of 3 brutal campaigns, the Iroquois Confederacy sued for peace. The following year, the Haudenosaunee began to establish their own villages in the territories of the 5 nations they had destroyed, eventually forming 7 settlements along the northern shores of Lake Ontario, which the French called the Iroquois du Nord villages. Simultaneously, a band of Mohawk established the village of Gachnawaga on the southern shores of the St. Lawrence, just southwest of Montreal. These people would uniquely remain friendly with the French throughout the remainder of their tenure in Canada. Relations between the French and Iroquois Confederacy soured in 1687, and fighting once again resumed in the Laurentian Valley and the forests of upstate New York. This final stage of the Beaver Wars came to a conclusion in 1701 with the signing of the Great Peace of Montreal, which stipulated that the natives of the Iroquois Confederacy confined their haunts to their ancestral lands south of the St. Lawrence River and Lake Ontario. Some Iroquois returned to Canadian territory in 1760 after the British conquest of Canada, following their English allies north into the old domain of the French. This exodus accelerated during the American Revolution, when the Continental Army drove many Iroquois bands that had chosen to remain in upstate New York north into British territory. Throughout the ensuing decades, displaced Iroquois firmly inserted themselves into the fabric of Canadian society, becoming prolific voyageurs for the Northwest Company and its rival, the Hudson's Bay Company, and fighting alongside the Canadian militia during the War of 1812. In addition to their labor, wilderness savvy, and martial prowess, the Iroquois imported their traditional legends to the Great White North, among which were tales of little people. American ethnologist Erminie Adele Smith included some of these stories in her 1883 book, Myths of the Iroquois, drawing heavily from informants of Onondaga extraction. Another creation of the fertile Indian fancy, she wrote, consists of the race of pygmies, Lilliputian in size, but mighty in skill and deed. They carved out the beauties of rock, cliff, and cave, but also they were endowed with the mightier power of destroying the monster animals which endangered the life of man. She went on to relate an old Iroquois story bearing a remarkable resemblance to the Wyandot legend of the little people who drove the witch buffalo from Kentucky's Big Bone Lick. According to this story, an Iroquois war party once traveled south to raid the settlements of the Cherokee in the swamps of Florida. On the homeward journey, the chief of this raiding party fell ill and was left to die on the banks of a river in the Allegheny Mountains of West Virginia. During the night, Smith wrote, the sick chief lying on the bank heard the soft sounds of a canoe's approach and saw 3 male pygmies landing hurriedly. Finding him, they bade him to lie there until they returned, as they were going to a neighboring salt lick where many strange animals watered, and where they were to watch for some of them to come up out of the earth. Reaching the place, the pygmies found that the animals had not come out of the ground. They hid themselves and soon saw a male buffalo approach. The beast looked around and began to drink, and immediately 2 buffalo cows arose out of the lick. The 3 animals, after quenching their thirst, lay down upon the bank. The pygmies, seeing that the animals were becoming restless and uneasy, concluded wisely to shoot them, and succeeded in killing the 2 buffalo cows. That accomplished, the little people returned to the dying war chief and restored him to health. He returned home to his people and punished the warriors who had left him to die. From a strong desire to see the lick, Smith continued, a large party searched for it and found it surrounding with bones of various large animals killed by the pygmies. The Seneca are another Iroquois nation with traditional stories of little people. In her book, Erminie Smith included one such story from one of the 2 Seneca reservations in upstate New York, told to her by an elder who knew the persons involved. One day, a band member named Mr. Johnson and a handful of hunters set out into a distant forest in search of game. They killed so many animals during their hunting trip that they were obliged to leave the bulk of the meat to rot, opting to carry the more lucrative skins instead. Before embarking on their return journey, the hunters decided to make one last push into the wilderness to see if any more game was to be found. The forest proved to be unnaturally deserted, however, and soon the hunters began to starve. No sooner had they begun to despair than the hunters were approached by a pygmy who told them that they were being punished for their greed and wastefulness. The little man gave them an ultimatum, telling them that they could either relinquish the skins they had harvested or starve to death. He agreed to give them time to consider his proposal, and informed them that they could summon him, or one of his diminutive kinsmen, by tapping on a certain rock in the woods. After some deliberation, the hunters decided to negotiate for a better deal. They tapped on the rock, and agreed to concede to the pygmies' demands on the condition that they were given sufficient food for their return journey, and guided home. The little ambassador who responded to their summons proceeded to take the hunters to a spacious cave, where they were to wait until his fellow dwarves came to a consensus regarding their fate. The following day, the ambassador returned to the cavern and informed the hunters that their transgressions had been forgiven, and that they would be allowed to keep their furs. He asked them to remain in the cave one more night, and promised to call on them before dawn. About midnight, Smith wrote, they were awakened and found themselves in their first camping ground. The Senecas were informed that they were brought there by their ever-vigilant pygmy friends. In her posthumous 1908 book, Myths and Legends of the New York State Iroquois, which she co-authored with Seneca anthropologist Arthur Caswell Parker, American historian Harriet Maxwell Converse elaborated on the Seneca conception of the pygmies, supposed to haunt the Laurentian Northwoods. Among the fable folk of the Iroquois, the Jagao, or invisible little people, are beings empowered to serve with the same authority as the greater spirits. These little people are divided into 3 tribes: the Gaoga of the rocks and rivers, the Gandeya of the fruits and grains, and the Odanwas of the under-earth shadows. The Gahonga, guardians of streams, dwell in rock caves beside the waters, and though dwarf in being, are gigantic in strength. They can uproot the largest tree by a twist of the hand, and hurl massive rocks into the rivers to lift the waters when floods threaten. They have frequently visited Indians in awake dreams and led them to their dwelling places, and then challenged them to feats of strength, such as playing ball with the rocks, often hurling them high out of sight in the air. Because of this fondness, the Indians often call them stone throwers. The editor of Converse's book elaborated on the concept of these rock-tossing pygmies in a footnote, writing, "The stone throwers are a band of elves who are fond of playing harmless pranks. Should one offend them, however, the prank may cease to be harmless." An Indian who discovered that he had been punished by them at once holds a proper ceremony for their propitiation. Mr. M.R. Harrington, who questioned the Oneidas regarding their belief in the Jagoo, was told that when a good round stone was needed for a hammer or a corn crusher, then an Indian would go down to a creek and place an offering of tobacco beneath a flat stone, and returning the next day, find within the radius of a man's length a stone just suitable for his purposes. Converse went on to explain how, in times of drought, Indians went into the forest and searched along mountain streams until they found signs of the Gahonga, little cup-shaped hollows in the soft earth that fringes streams. Natives would scoop up the mud from these depressions and smear it on a sheet of bark, which they would then dry in the sun. These so-called dew cup charms would then be placed inside the longhouse in the hope that they would attract Gandeya, who would make the surrounding gardens fertile. In their province of watchfulness, she wrote, they instruct the fish, directing their movements, and giving them shelter in their deep-water caves if pursued by merciless fishermen, or confused in the whirl of the flood. They know the twists of every trap, and will loosen them to release the captive fish when they deem it wise to do so. They can command a fruitful or barren season, and unless propitiated frequently, punish negligence with famine. Converse went on to relate an old Seneca legend about an orphan boy who was approached by a Gahunga canoe while playing by the side of the river. The little people invited the boy to join them in their tiny canoe, and after some hesitation, the boy consented. The tiny paddlers proceeded to launch the canoe through the air and into the side of a rock cliff, landing in a cave where other little people were congregated. After teaching the boy their occult knowledge over what seemed to him to be a period of several days, the pygmies restored the boy to his people. Upon his return, the boy discovered that he had become a very large man, and that 40 years had elapsed since he stepped into the little people's canoe. One arcane rite, which the boy learned from his tiny hosts, was a ritual called the Dark Dance, by which the Iroquois could solicit the assistance of the little people. Canadian-American anthropologist Anthony C.F. Wallace briefly alluded to this ceremony in his article for the 1958 issue of the American Anthropologist, writing that the Iroquois of the 17th century believed that the daytime visions of dwarf spirits, to which Converse earlier alluded, indicated a need for the dark dance of the Little People Society. American author John Beerhorst elaborated on this ritual in his 1998 book, The Deet-Katu, Native American Stories About Little People, which he said was practiced by Seneca singers and dancers who met indoors after nightfall. It is said that the wee folk themselves enter the darkened room and join in the singing, he wrote, bringing with them the power to cure sickness. Later in his book, Beerhorst included an alternate version of the Seneca story purporting to explain the origin of the dark dance. In this tale, a hunter was captured by the little people and taught the intricacies of the procedure, a nighttime ceremony performed in the dark, involving singing, drumming, and the serving of strawberry soup. Beerhorst appears to have drawn this story from Arthur Caswell Parker's 1923 book, Seneca Myths and Folktales. The original tale which Parker relates evokes Washington Irving's famous 1819 short story Rip Van Winkle, and is clearly related to Harriet Maxwell Converse's tale of the orphan boy. In Parker's version of this legend, a young man named Snow, who lived with his parents on a riverbank, set out one day to hunt cedar waxwings. He followed the birds as they flew to escape him, inadvertently stumbling into a dark, steep gorge filled with rushing water. Unable to escape this chasm, he sat down on a rock and began to mope. Suddenly, Parker wrote, he heard a stone strike the ground at his feet. He looked about the gloom, and then heard another strike. The next time, the stone struck him on the forehead between the eyes, and Snow fell over like a dead person. While he lay paralyzed, Snow heard voices speaking all around him, accompanied by the patter of what sounded like tiny feet. Mustering his courage, Snow opened his eyes and looked about. All around him were pygmies, dwarf people dressed like Indians, whom Parker called Jojion. There was a shout when he opened his eyes, the anthropologist wrote, and he was told to rise and be seated. He could now clearly see by the aid of a fire on the slaty bottom of the creek. At length, one of the little people spoke, asking him if he had tobacco. Snow searched through his hunting pouch and found a small quantity, which he gave the chief. This caused an expression of great pleasure. The chief of the little people now spoke. "You have come to our home," said he. "We sent for you, in order that we might teach you our ways. You are to stay here until you have learned our customs." Snow lived with the little people and became versed in all their arts. He was told that when the Jojion were in need of tobacco, they would be heard singing, and then the Indians must throw tobacco into the gulches where the sound emanated. Sometimes drumming would be heard instead of singing, and this also indicated the need of tobacco. When they deemed his education complete, the little people returned Snow to his parents, who were much older than he remembered them. They scarcely knew him because of his long absence, Parker wrote, which seemed to him only a few days. Snow now called together his friends and taught them the ceremonies and songs of the little people, and these ceremonies have come down to this day. They must be performed in the dark. Beerhorst included 4 other Seneca little people stories in his book. In one of the tales, a young man beloved by his village married a pygmy woman, who made him a lucky hunter. Heedless of his wife's warnings, the man fell for the charms of a strange woman he met in the woods, who proved to be an evil snake woman with preternatural abilities and malicious intentions. This violation of his wife's trust destroyed the luck he had acquired, reducing him to poverty. Another brief tale tells of a boy who encountered a pair of little people while hunting in the forest. One of the dwarves offered to give the boy his bow. When the young hunter refused the offer on account of the weapon's tiny size, the little man demonstrated its power by shooting an arrow up into the clouds. He and his tiny companion then departed, flying through the air in their canoe in a native precursor to the chasse galerie of French-Canadian tradition. Bierhorst included 2 more Seneca Little People stories in his book, both of which he doubtless acquired from the 1918 book, Seneca Fiction, Legends, and Myths, written by American ethnologists Jeremiah Curtin and John Napoleon Brinton Hewitt. One of these stories seems to be a reversal of the changeling legend of Newfoundland, in which fairies steal human babies and replace them with hideous and cantankerous substitutes. In this tale, a luckless hunter stumbled upon a pygmy longhouse in the woods and stole a tiny infant he found therein, entranced by its infinitesimal beauty. He was shortly confronted by the baby's father, who demanded that he restore the child to him. The frightened hunter did as requested without protest. Out of gratitude for his cooperation, the little man gave the hunter a tiny arrowhead, which would bring him good luck as long as he kept it on his person. The man returned home and became the luckiest hunter in his village. In another story from Curtin and Hewitt's book, a little man married a female whirlwind, a dangerous elemental spirit called a Dagwan Owanyent, which embodies the power of the wind, and passed a number of deadly trials imposed upon him by his pernicious mother-in-law, accomplishing a variety of impressive feats by virtue of his preternatural abilities and astonishing physical strength. Bierhorst's book also contains a reproduction of a story from the Mohawk tribe, the easternmost of the Haudenosaunee nations. This tale appears to be a derivative of a story originally told by Mohawk elder Josephine Horn, published in November 1976 in Bulletin 427 of the New York State Museum. In this story, a girl named Gathering Flowers once fell asleep on the riverbank and awoke to the sound of strange voices. Sitting up, Horn said, she saw a family of little people, a little man, his tiny wife, and 3 wee children. A baby was on a wee little papoose board. Gathering Flowers' mother had often told the children stories about the little people, and said, if you ever see them, don't be frightened. Talk to them, be nice to them, and they will bring you luck. She remembered this when she saw the little people, so she was not too alarmed. Gathering Flowers invited the little people to sit with her, and shared her lunch with them, a meal of cornbread and apples. In return, the little people invited the girl to accompany them to their home. They came to a small rock, Horn continued, and the little man spit on his hands and rubbed the rock with them. Suddenly, the rock split open, and the little family went through it into the home. When Gathering Flowers protested that she couldn't fit through the tiny opening, her host rubbed saliva into her hair, effectively shrinking her to the same size as himself. She then followed the little man into the rock. After sharing a meal of soup with the little family, drawn from a pot that never emptied, Gathering Flowers was led out of the lithic layer and restored to her regular size. Her host swore her to tell nobody about his family and their home, and invited her to come visit them as often as she liked. Gathering Flowers took the little man up on his offer, and saw his family frequently, never telling a soul where she disappeared to on her riverside escapades. When her own family declared their intention to relocate to another seasonal village, she paid the little people a farewell visit. Out of gratitude for her friendship and confidentiality, the little people gifted her with a magic soup pot and granted her the wisdom to lead a harmonious life. These stories, passed down through oral tradition and preserved in ethnographic records, reveal a deeply rooted Iroquoian belief in preternatural beings who inhabit the edge of the civilized world. Mysterious diminutive figures who serve as guardians, teachers, and tricksters. Whether born from waking visions or secret encounters on the banks of wild streams, tales of these little people of Iroquoian legend hint at the possibility that the wilderness of the Ontario Peninsula might still hold mysteries beyond our understanding.